Welcome to episode 5 of the Liberty Itch podcast. My guest today is Senator David Leyonhjelm. David and I are not only connoisseurs of cranial fashion, we also share a passion for shooting sports. We like guns. David has been at the forefront of Australia's gun control debate, having written 2 books on the topic with a third on the way. He is well known for his libertarian stance, and he's consistently challenged Australia's strict firearm laws, arguing they infringe on citizens' right to self-defence and recreation, which they do. Australia has among the toughest gun control laws in the world, along with North Korea, Eritrea and Venezuela. It is not a policy to be proud of. David has been praised and criticised for his unwavering position on gun ownership. So today we'll dive into his perspectives on gun control, personal liberty, and the reality of how gun laws affect public safety versus individual rights. Mr. David Leyonhjelm, welcome to the Liberty Itch podcast. Thank you for coming onto the show.
Thank you.
Now, you've written very extensively, you've written books on gun control. And why don't we start with an overview of what the libertarian position is on gun control laws generally?
When I was a senator, I was in the Senate for 5 years. And during that time, people would come and say to me, I'm a libertarian. And I quite often would say to them, good, that's excellent news. What's your position on gun control? Oh, well, yes, that's a bit difficult. I think, Australia's gun laws are good. And I support what John Howard did in 1996 with banning semi-automatic rifles and all the other things that he did to impose very restrictive gun laws. My response to that was, in fact, you're not a libertarian at all. You might agree with me on particular issues, but you're not a libertarian. A libertarian thinks about the relationship between the individual, not the collective, the individual and the government. What is that relationship? Is the government your boss, or are you the boss of the government? Now, if you think the government is your boss, then of course you think it's fine for the government to have all the guns. And if you think it's fine for the government to have all the guns, the consequence is things like the police have the guns, security guards have the guns because they're highly regulated. The military, of course, have guns. But private individuals, they are allowed guns under sufferance. So they might be allowed them for sport or collecting or something like that. But there's no inherent right to have guns. It's an allowance. It's a concession by the government to basically allow you to have guns. But if you infringe what the government says is you misuse those guns in some way that the government defines, then you can lose that right. There's no inherent right.
There's no right to guns.
That's right. And that's the situation in Australia. You have to have the government's permission. You have to have a genuine reason to own a gun, and that genuine reason can be revoked almost on a whim by a bureaucrat.
And it's their interpretation of a genuine reason too. So it's not your version of it, it's theirs.
So it's the government's genuine reason. Yes, that's right. Now, the libertarian position on guns is the reverse of that. The libertarian would ask, well, why should I allow the government to have guns? I don't trust the government. The government is not safe. They are an inherent threat to my liberty. So libertarians are not anarchists. We will argue that there is a right for the government to exist, that government's responsibilities include defence of the country. So therefore, libertarians will defend the right of the military to have arms. They also believe that the government has a role to enforce contracts, and most libertarians accept crime control up to a point. So, there are grounds for the government to have guns. That does not mean that they're the only ones entitled to have guns. So the libertarian will argue, well, I have a right to a gun, and you, government, have to justify taking that right away from me. Not in a collective sense, not because I belong to a collective of some description, but because in my case, I am not safe with that gun. So it's an individual thing. So that's the difference. If you think what John Howard did in 1996 in Australia with Australia's gun laws, where he imposed bans on semi-automatics, bans on certain types of pistols, imposed substantial licensing requirements. If you think that's acceptable, you're not a libertarian. Now, some people will say, fine, that's it. I'm not a libertarian. But I think it is important that that's recognised. If you're a libertarian, the boot's on the other foot. It's the onus is on the government to say why you, in every case, should not have guns.
Okay. So, in the case of these people who claim to be libertarians otherwise, except for the gun control issue, what's their retort to your response then?
Well, mostly discomfort, because I haven't thought the issue through. And I'm not denigrating those people. I'd rather have them agree with me on 90% of things than not at all. So, we don't want to burn those people and lose them from libertarian support. But I think it is important to understand that they are not libertarians. The libertarian principle is you are in charge of the government, not vice versa. The government is answerable to you. And the old saying is, when the government fears the people, there is liberty. When the people fear the government, there is tyranny.
Yeah.
How can there ever be anything other than potential tyranny when the government has the guns and the people don't have the guns? We in fact saw some evidence of that during the COVID silliness, and that's a mild word for it, when we had horrendous lockdowns in Australia. Absolutely terrible situation with lockdowns. And there's not much we could do about it. The police were overbearing, very hairy-chested enforcement of these lockdown rules. They tried to impose lockdowns in various states of America, and they didn't get very far. They were largely ignored. Why? Because the police knew that if they tried to enforce them too far, they would strike armed resistance. Now, some people say, "Oh, well, they were wrong, and somebody was wrong, and the police should have enforced these lockdowns." In hindsight, of course, we now know the lockdowns achieved nothing. But at the time, their argument was, "But that's important for public health." But the fact remains, the lockdowns were essentially voluntary in most states of America because the police couldn't enforce them. Why couldn't the police enforce them? Because they knew that a large proportion of the public was armed, and if they got too heavy-handed, then things would get ugly. Now, that's just one small example. If you go through the 20th century, all the dictatorships, all the mass murders, every single one of them was accompanied by gun control. There were no exceptions at all. You can go right back to the Armenian genocide by the Turks. You can go to the Second World War, of course, with the Nazis. They were big on gun control. Only good, safe Nazi party members were allowed to have guns. The first people who were banned from owning guns were the Jews. So Rwanda, before the massive massacres in Rwanda, there was gun control imposed. Pol Pot in Cambodia imposed gun control. Many, many examples right through the 20th century where dictatorships and particularly mass murders, massacres, genocides, as they call them, were preceded by or accompanied by gun control. So libertarians, genuine libertarians, and I'm not denigrating those who support libertarian values on some areas, but genuine libertarians acknowledge that the government is the greatest threat to our liberty. And the only way to ensure the government doesn't become a threat, or even worse than a threat, an overt imposer on our liberties, is to make sure that they don't have all the guns, and the people whose liberties are at stake have guns so that they can protect themselves from whatever the government's designs are. And this is not fantasy, this is not imaginary or theoretical. This is based on experience from the 20th century.
And my understanding is the Second Amendment of the US Constitution is based on the idea that, it's about the government coming for the people more than an external threat. That's why the right to bear arms is written into the Constitution.
That's quite right. So John Locke, the English philosopher, was a major influence on the people who wrote the American Constitution. And John Locke's view was that government was, the term is misused, but a necessary evil, and it should be, and the government should be kept under strict control. How do you keep it under strict control? Well, first of all, you don't take guns away from the people, because they're the means by which they resist the government if it gets too overbearing. And then, as Thomas Jefferson said, if the government does get too overbearing, he would defend the right of a revolution to replace the government with a better one. And John Locke took the same view. That's where Jefferson got his ideas. And you can't do that if the government has all the guns and you don't have them.
Obviously, yes.
Mm.
It's very interesting from traveling around and going to a country like Switzerland, which has extraordinarily low levels of gun violence, and yet it's mandated everybody has a gun. Everybody does military service. And when I was...
Yeah. So I've got a friend who lives in Switzerland, wrote a chapter for my book on guns.
Yeah.
And he explained how it works. Everybody does national service. They get conscripted into the army. They do a couple of years, I think. They have their service rifle, which is what the anti-gun people would call an assault rifle. It's a full automatic.
It's a 308 caliber or a 223. It's
NATO caliber or 223. I'm not sure which it is.
Yeah.
They've changed over the years. And, very modern, sophisticated rifle. They take it home. They are given ammunition by the military. They are encouraged to buy more ammunition. They keep it at home. They are encouraged to practice with it, to shoot in shooting competitions. When they leave the military, if they want to, they are entitled to keep the rifle. And they stop receiving free ammunition from the military. They have to buy their own, but they are encouraged they are allowed to keep the rifle. Many of them do. Many don't, of course. They're not interested in shooting as a sport. But there are a lot of them have rifles, and they shoot them in competitions. And it's amazing to drive around Switzerland and look, and every now and then you see this funny looking thing almost in the middle of a village quite often, and there's maybe humps of green grass and funny little frames and things like that, and you ask, what is that? And it's a rifle range right in the middle of a village.
Middle of this, yeah.
It's amazing. And they think nothing of it. They have baffles so the bullets don't go wandering off into the street and kill people. It's very, very safe.
Yep.
And the gun crime, and there are far more guns relative to the population in Switzerland than there are in places like Australia. And yet the violent crime levels in Switzerland are no higher than they are in Australia. They're pretty much similar year to year. There's really no relationship, in fact, in any country where you can point to the level of guns and say, well, that's a contributor to the gun violence. It's internationally that argument doesn't stand up. But Switzerland is an absolute classic example. The other country that is also like that is the Czech Republic, Czechia as they call it these days. There are not many people.
CZ.
Not many people seem to use that term. But there they have concealed carry is a constitutional right. You can lose that right if you're silly and you do something stupid with a firearm, but this presumption is in favour of granting you that right. And there are plenty of Czech people who carry a gun for self-defence like they do in America. Now it's almost every state in America. In fact, I think it is every state in America. It varies a little bit from time to time, where you can get a permit to carry a gun. There are now about half the states where you don't even need a permit. You can just carry a gun with or without a permit. It's called constitutional carry. Czechia is a bit like the majority of the states in America. You can get a permit, and the presumption is in favour of granting that permit. So they need a reason not to grant you that permit. Now, Czechia, that's violent gun crime, violent crime overall, is comparable to that of Switzerland and comparable to that of Australia. And yet in Australia, you can't even carry a pocket knife to defend yourself. You can't have a pepper spray to defend yourself. There's really no legal way you can carry a weapon at all. And as for owning guns, the legal means of owning guns or justification for owning guns is sport, hunting, and collecting. There's nothing else. And yet you would think if the relationship between guns and crime, if there was a relationship, Australia ought to have a very low crime rate. Well, it doesn't.
But it
Gun
doesn't,
crime, it doesn't. There are still plenty of examples of gun crime. So, my argument is, and the point I made in my book, and I'm writing another book about gun crime as well, the basic proposition is gun crime and guns themselves, are ownership of guns and the density of guns, in other words, the number of guns per head of population, are independent variables. They move independently of each other. There's no cause and effect relationship between the two. They're just quite independent. So you can have very liberal gun laws and very low crime, and vice versa. You can have very strict gun laws and very low crime or very high crime. And the reason is one does not affect the other. They are independent variables. That's what the statisticians call it.
And America is probably the perfect example of that, where some of the states with the highest gun control regulations have some of the highest crime, and other ones which have the least interference have relatively lesser crime. So, there doesn't
Yeah, you're right. My classic example in America is Vermont, the state of Vermont.
Yeah.
They have never had a law controlling guns in the state. There's the federal law.
At all, okay.
That's it. And so you have been able to carry a gun, use a gun, own a gun, subject only to federal law, no state law. So the federal law basically says you can't buy a gun if you're a felon, and that. Or there are other variations, but that's about it. In Vermont, that's it. There's no other law. You've been able to carry a gun for self-defense if you want to forever. And in fact, it caused a problem because there were some states that said, well, we've got a permit system and we want to recognize the permit system of other states. And Vermont said, we haven't got a permit system. So the people who lived in Vermont were having troubles traveling to other states. I think there was discussion about Vermont having to bring in a permit system just so it could be recognized by the other states. But anyway, my point is this: Vermont has a level of gun crime which is comparable to that of Australia.
Wow.
It is very, very safe state. Now, people say, oh, well, it's rural. Well, yes,
Difference.
but not all of it.
There's people and there's guns, yeah.
There's people and there's guns, What are you arguing? So you're saying only cities are dangerous? It's a silly argument. But anyway, the point is Vermont has always had extremely liberal gun laws, in fact, almost nothing, and lots of guns, lots of gun ownership, high gun ownership, very low levels of crime, and that's in America. And in the same country, you've got places like Chicago, Washington, D.C., very strict gun laws and massive violence problem, including gun violence. So, you cannot join the dots between them.
All right. Well, let's turn the focus to Australia, and it was essentially the Port Arthur massacre that kicked off the real strict gun laws that we now have that are world famous and the top 10 strictest gun laws in the world. What are the meat and potatoes of those gun laws, and what effect have they had?
So they basically banned semi-automatic long arms, rifles and shotguns. They also restricted pistols, so their barrel lengths had to be a minimum length. The calibers, 40 caliber is about the maximum you can have. 38 special, I think, is the largest you can have. There were limits on magazine capacity. There were storage requirements introduced and licensing requirements. So the law specifically says gun ownership is a privilege, not a right. And that privilege can be removed, and it's somewhat whimsical the way in which it's imposed. You have to have a genuine reason, as I mentioned before. So the genuine reasons are collecting, hunting, and target shooting. Self-defense is not a genuine reason, not a non-acceptable reason. Firearms have to be stored in a safe. That's safe storage, it's called. Ammunition has to be locked up. Bolts have to be removed from rifles where a bolt is where there is a bolt. Transport of firearms is specified as well, so they have to be in a locked container. Pistols require a trigger lock in them. So there's a whole series of laws and rules and regulations and relatively petty things imposed on the entire shooting community. It was subject to, it was imposed at the federal level. The federal government doesn't have jurisdiction over firearms in Australia. It's a state jurisdiction. But the federal government got involved and drafted up a thing called the National Firearms Agreement, which each of the states signed up to. So it's sort of the template for each of the states. Although they are now increasingly wandering away from that, they're starting to interpret it or add bits to it or take bits from it. It's not becoming more liberal, it's becoming more restrictive over time, to the point now where we're seeing, for example, in New South Wales, imitation firearms, plastic water pistols that look like prohibited firearms are now classified as prohibited firearms. Air pistols and air rifles, which in some countries are not even regulated at all. You have to be very unlucky to kill somebody with an air rifle.
Try really hard.
Pistol.
Yeah.
You really have to shoot them in the right spot. They'd be unlucky as hell.
You'd be hard pressed to penetrate the soft skin. It's it'll bruise and it'll hurt, but
Yeah, no, they yes. I mean, they might shoot you even if they shot you in the eye, they wouldn't kill you.
No.
So, but nonetheless, they're still treated the same as, a 38 rifle, a 9mm pistol or a 308 rifle. Same regulations, same laws apply to air rifles and air pistols as those other much more powerful firearms. And now in Western Australia, there is new legislation just not yet taken effect, but it still soon will be, on how many guns you're allowed to own. If you're a collector, you're allowed to own 10, I think. If you're a sports shooter, I might be wrong about that. If you're a sports shooter, it might be 10. If you're a hunter, it's 5, something like that. Now, people will say, oh, well, what do you need more guns for? I often get that question. What do you need guns for? That's the wrong question.
Yeah.
The right question is, why shouldn't I have that many guns? What harm does it do? The libertarian question is always, the government has to justify stopping me from doing it. Now, there's no justification for putting limits on the number of firearms you own. There's no justification for saying you can only have so many pistols. If you shoot multiple disciplines in pistol, you could easily require half a dozen, 10 pistols. If you shoot multiple disciplines in rifles, you could easily require 10 rifles, no problem at all, depending on how active you are and what sort of hunting you do. If you go to Africa, you need really big bores. If you go shoot buffaloes up in Northern Territory, or you might shoot rabbits and foxes down south. Pigs, pigs require a different caliber from rabbits and foxes. Ducks, again, a different firearm. All sorts of variabilities in that, and the government. The question that should be asked of the government is, why shouldn't they do that? So the question then becomes, well, what's being achieved by placing limits on the kind of firearm you own or how many you can have?
Yes.
And the answer is, there's no evidence that it makes any difference. So they started off in 1996 banning semi-automatic guns. Full autos were already banned, although they're a lot of fun, and I don't see any great reason for that either. In Switzerland, I've got a friend who's got full autos, and they allow them. They regulate them a little bit more tightly than the other stuff, but they still allow them. The issue, or the assumption seems to be that if you have a gun that fires more rapidly, that somehow, if you go haywire, you'll kill more people.
Yeah.
There's zero evidence for that. Zero. There is also an example that I've used in my book of the 303 Leyonhjelm rifle that was introduced at the time of the Boer War, so the turn of the century, or the previous century. They had the British military had a discipline that they called the Mad Minute, and it involved shooting as many shots as you could get away at a target, a certain size target down the range. and the good shooters could shoot into the target. The target wasn't all that big. They could hit the target multiple times in a minute. Now, for anyone who's shot a machine gun or a submachine gun,
Over the place.
Everywhere. They go everywhere. Yeah. The idea that you could do better with a machine gun or a submachine gun than these guys with their Lee-Enfield 303s, pulling the bolt backwards and forwards and shooting at a target down the range in a minute is fanciful. You can either typically shoot accurately or fast. You can't do both. You've got to be really good to do both, and not many people are really good. And the faster you go, the less accurate you become. Nothing is achieved by limiting guns on the basis of how fast they can shoot. Nothing at all. There's zero evidence that some kind of mass shooting is averted by having only guns available that can shoot slowly as they think.
Even on the face of the entire thing is that we're talking about two different classes of people. The kind of person who's going to go out and violently murder as many people as they possibly can tend not to care too much what laws you put in place, because that's already illegal. So if they want to get modified Glocks with 30-round magazines that can actually shoot in full auto mode, they can get them on the black market. It's not even hard to do. It doesn't cost that much more than it does to acquire a Glock legally. No. So those people, the ones with the guns now, are criminals anyway, and they're still going to be the ones who are going to be doing all the violent things. The people who are competitive shooters who love their guns, are absolutely passionate about them, they're not hurting anyone. They love guns. They like shooting them with other people.
The people who impose these sort of laws do make an assumption that having imposed a law, nobody will break it.
Yeah, so it's ridiculous.
If they ban certain types of guns, nobody will have them.
Yeah.
So there's assumptions behind these laws that are challengeable, but that's the thinking. But even that thinking, even if that was true, that thinking is silly. There is no evidence that restricting guns based on how fast they can shoot has any effect on gun violence or numbers of casualties or anything like that. So the same argument applies to calibers. In Australia, we have limits on the firearm calibers, both rifles and pistols. Pistols, the limit is 38 special, I think, from memory. I think 40 caliber is above the limit. So 45s you can't have. You can with a special permit.
Yeah, I've shot a 45 at the club myself. So yeah, but it's somewhere around there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you can't have them anymore except with a special permit. In addition to your pistol license. Most of the IPSC and other stuff is 38
Yeah.
special, 38
super comp. Yeah.
37, yeah. So, but the assumption is that, say you're intent on doing some malicious damage with a pistol, that you'll do more damage with a 45 than you will with a 38. I mean, it's just brain dead thinking. It's absolutely idiotic. It betrays a complete ignorance of what guns are about and what makes them work. Similar sort of stupidity applies to the magazine capacity. We can't have anything over a 10 magazine capacity rifle in Australia, and they introduce magazine capacities in other countries as well, including California. I understand has a 10-round magazine capacity.
Yeah.
The assumption, of course, is that if you have a 30-round magazine, for example, somehow or other you will kill more people rather than carry 2 10-round magazines or 3 10-round magazines. And after you've shot 10 people, you'll swap that magazine out, put another 10-round in, shoot another 10 people, and put another 10 rounds in. I mean, seriously, is that what they think? It's just brain dead nonsense.
It's ridiculous. As I told you, I used to shoot IPSC A grade open division, and shot to shot, a reload was 1 second, meaning you would shoot a bullet, you would reload the magazine and shoot the next bullet, and there was 1 second elapsed in between. And you don't put the gun down; it's always up. You change magazine, and you're still straight back on sights again. So if you were so inclined, it's not going to slow you down one little bit. It's much more fun going overseas and shooting competitions with 30-round magazines because you need less strategy to do it. So we actually have some of the best IPSC shooters in the world produced in Australia. But the strategy for shooting rounds is all dictated by how to get around the 10-round capacity.
Yeah.
But we can then go and shoot competitively with the best in the world and still manage. So clearly there's no handicap, really, from doing it.
The only downside, really, is you got all this pain in your ribs because you're carrying all these multiple magazines in your belt and swapping them out as you go. And whereas if you had a 30-round magazine or even a 20-round magazine, there'd be less pain from the magazine poking into your ribs.
Well, then there's also the inherent contradictions where they're saying that you've got to have a barrel length over 5 inches because otherwise it's too easy to conceal and you'd rob a bank or something. It's like, have they ever seen what a 30-round magazine looks like? We call them big sticks because they're like 40 centimeters long with a weight on the bottom of the mag. They're huge things. Like, you're not going to conceal that thing. It's like an Uzi. It's huge. The contradictions are just thick and strong all the way through.
Well, that's right. Well, that also is the same argument, or the same issue applies to pistols, barrel length of pistols that Howard introduced in 2002, I think it was, following a shooting in Monash University by a nutcase. I think only 2 or 3 people were casualties, and yet Howard decided it was time to move on pistols. As a consequence of that, there is a minimum barrel length. Now, there was absolutely nothing, minimum barrel length and magazine capacity and caliber. There's absolutely nothing would have changed about that Monash University shooting if any of those restrictions had applied.
Yeah.
The magazine capacity was irrelevant because there were not enough shots fired. The caliber made no difference. They were lethal, whatever the caliber was. It was under was under the maximum, and the barrel length is neither here nor there. Once you start shooting somebody, the barrel length is whatever it is. It makes no difference. It's only a concealment factor, and even then, carrying a pistol with a short barrel versus a medium or longer barrel,
makes no
what
damn
difference does it make?
Yeah.
Sporting shooters are not that fussed about really short barrels anyway, because they reduce accuracy.
Less accurate, and
but it was just pointless nonsense, and achieved nothing.
Yeah.
That's often the case with gun control around the world. It achieves nothing. It's for symbolic purposes in many cases. But
it was a knee-jerk react. I mean, these heavy-handed laws were the knee-jerk reaction to the Port Arthur shooting, ostensibly. And
so knee-jerk reactions. There was often a period in which they reflect on the knee-jerk and wonder whether they did the right thing. Unfortunately, neither Howard nor the Liberal Party or Labor Party, for that matter, which cheered him on, have ever stopped and thought about. What did we get it right? Did what we introduce make a difference? And the answer to that is no, it didn't. There was a declining rate of murders in Australia in 1996 when the gun laws were introduced. It had been trending slowly down year after year after year. There has been a very, very good study looking at the rate of murders subsequent to the introduction of the gun laws. The rate of murder declined at precisely the same rate as it did before the gun laws were introduced. There was no break. There was no blip. There was nothing, no change.
No kick down.
Just continued on the same slope downwards. It's just a gradual decline, but it's gradually as a rate relative to the population. The rate of gun violence or gun deaths and in fact overall murders has been declining year on year. So that's one piece of evidence which says it did nothing. Now, of course, there are people who are dishonest in the sociology sciences who will point to the difference between 1996 and some 10, 20 years later and say, look at that, the gun violence or even the overall murder rate went down since 1996. Therefore, it was the gun laws that did it. It's deceitful as hell. It's dreadful what they do. And there are a few studies around that sometimes get cited that are based on that assumption. The other thing that is relevant to these gun laws is mass murders.
Yes.
So there were 3, I think, mass murders prior to the Port Arthur mass murder, and 2 of them in Victoria. One was a shootout involving bikies in Sydney. The Queen Street, Hoddle Street, the one in Sydney involving the bikies, and then was Port Arthur. So that was it. That basically is it as far as the incidents that prompted this and the mass murder.
Just for the audience, a mass shooting is 5 or more. Is that correct? That's
how it's characterized. I was going to come to that. Yeah. So the FBI says 5 including the victim, or the perpetrator, I should say. 5 including the perpetrator, or not including the perpetrator. I'm not sure which. Anyway, they then attempted to. So there was a mass shooting in Australia. They then attempted to redefine what a mass shooting was, to exclude that particular incident from being counted. And so there were papers published by people who ought to know better, who were, supposedly scientific and objective, but obviously not, who argued that, the gun laws still have prevented any mass shootings. And the only reason they could say that was because they'd redefined
the definition of mass shooting.
But there has been several incidents since then that exceed even their definition. And so we now have mass murders subsequent to the gun laws, which proves that the gun laws did not stop them. They still occur. So
I understand the organised crime. If there's what would otherwise be categorized as a mass shooting, it occurs as gang violence or something like that. It gets categorized now under gang violence or organized crime or some other categorization that keeps it out of the mass shooting category for the purpose of the statistics. It's
I'm not aware of that one, but I am aware of where mass shootings have been redefined as not mass shootings because there wasn't enough in them, and so they raised the number in order to keep them out.
Yeah.
Now, so what we're talking about though is a lack of objective evidence for the elements of gun control, lack of objective evidence for restricting the type of firearm, semi-automatic, fully automatic, pump action, whatever type, that they think is restricting it as legitimate. There's no evidence to show that it makes any difference. There's no evidence to show that it makes any difference if they restrict the caliber. There's no evidence that it makes any difference if they restrict the magazine capacity. Indeed, in America, they restricted semi-automatic, what they call assault rifles, the AR-15, which is a very nice little rifle. I used to own one myself.
Got one here in Georgia. In Georgia, as a foreigner, I was able to come here, pass my gun license, pistol, rifle, SBR actually, so an AR-15 with only a 8.5-inch barrel on it, and semi-automatic shotgun as well, and it's perfectly fine, and you're free to go out to any non-residential area and shoot it. And shootings here are non-existent. It's just not a thing. Gun ownership is wide, and it's just not a problem.
Yeah. It's a cultural. If there's high levels of gun violence as a cultural problem, not a firearms problem. That's
correct.
That's the fact of it.
100%.
They are independent variables. Gun ownership and violence are independent variables. Anyway, getting back to the key point, there is no evidence that restricting AR-15s, so-called assault rifles, semi-automatics, full automatics, restricting the caliber, restricting the magazine capacity makes any difference. There is no evidence that making that fewer guns in the community makes any difference to the gun or to deaths and firearm violence or even overall violence. There is no evidence that it does. There's no correlation. If you compare country to country around the world, there is no evidence of a relationship between the two. There is a very strong perception in some circles in the gun control world that fewer guns in the community is somehow safer. There is no evidence for that either, no objective evidence. But what's happening now is this feeling that feelings matter. So John Howard's kicked that off by arguing about America having a gun culture. We don't want America's gun culture in Australia. Well, what is the gun culture? It normalizes gun ownership, as people say. So people are accustomed to having guns around them. They accept that the safe way to handle them is the safe way to handle them, and that if they're handled safely, there's nothing to fear from them. That attitude doesn't exist in Australia. We now have a very common perception that the fewer guns there are in the community, the safer we are, irrespective of the objective evidence. And we have gun laws being introduced based on the idea of just reducing the number of guns. So people will say, oh, I wouldn't feel comfortable if my next door neighbour had a gun. I wouldn't feel comfortable if there was a gun in the house. Well, I mean, you could say, well, who gives a rat's what you feel? That's not relevant to me, but that's the way the laws are being crafted. We are increasingly.
Sorry to interrupt, but it's an interesting point. That was when I first joined my first gun club. I was actually taken aback at how very, very seriously everybody took gun safety, and it's it's bred into you. Everybody of every socioeconomic group is hugely respectful of how you treat your firearms. You
Yeah.
never point the muzzle in the wrong direction. You always show unloaded. You follow all of the rules with huge amounts of respect, to the point that I was actually shocked that people were so seemingly over the top about gun safety, but very quickly you get ingrained into the culture too. And as soon as you see anybody doing anything slightly wrong while handling a firearm, you freak out too. It's like, what the hell do you think you're doing? That's unacceptable behavior. But not because of rules. It's a cultural thing. It's ingrained in the gun community. And absolutely, it's you. When people have expressed that guns are dangerous, yada, 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 it's just like you wish that you could show them this is how people with guns actually act and behave with guns. They're more respectful, more considerate, more aware of themselves and the firearm than other people ever would be. And that fear is obviously completely allayed once you understand that everybody around you all feels exactly the same way about it. Nobody would let anybody do anything wrong. It's
That's right.
And not one law is required for any of this. This is everyone understands, and all around the world it's the same thing. It's
safest place to be. Safest place to be when there's guns around is on a rifle range.
Is on a rifle range with other shooters.
With other shooters.
Yeah.
That's precisely right.
And that's what I found out with the IPSC shooting too. It's like with other sports, it's like you could get a warning or something like that. In IPSC, no, it's instant disqualification, DQ. It's if you have an accidental discharge because even the gun was pointing in the right direction, but you pulled the trigger when you didn't mean to, you're disqualified. You're out of the competition 100% immediately. The competitor understands, all of the other people understand, everyone feels bad for them, but you're off the range. It's go home. And it's
That's
like,
right.
this is how serious it is. It's not a matter that anyone takes lightly, you know? So
you're absolutely right. No, I've shot IPSC myself, and I know what you're saying is correct. So anyway, the question then becomes, people who don't know anything about guns, who freak out when you have pictures of guns on kids' T-shirts, and kids point their fingers and go bang, bang, and they get sent home. And, so it becomes emotional. You think, okay, no, what's behind that? Well, it's not the only example of feelings sneaking into legislation. So we have infringements on free speech based on feelings. We have 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act in Australia, for example, which prohibits speech which offends and insults, amongst other things. Who is to decide who is offended or insulted? You can call somebody a bastard and they think you're a great bloke for calling them a bastard, or another situation, you call them a bastard and they take great offence at it. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. And yet it's the same notion that feelings should drive gun control. I don't like guns, therefore they should be banned.
yes,
We also get the same thing with smoking, of course. So, smoking is dangerous if you breathe in the smoke, secondary smoking. But if you're a couple of meters away and you're not breathing in the smoke, apart from the fact that you don't like the smell of the cigarettes, they're not doing you any harm. And yet there's plenty of laws that prohibit smoking based on the fact that you can smell the smoke. That's, again, feelings. So what we've got is laws about subjective laws about things that are subjective, that are based on feelings, intruding into what ought to be an objective legal environment. What I'd like to talk about to finish up, though, is how guns ought to be regulated.
Yeah, well, that would be my next question. Yeah, what's your solution to
in an acceptable way? Yes. So, in parts of America, the argument is that there is no role for the government in gun control. The government can never get it right, and they will always go too far. They will always nominate who shouldn't have a gun, and then they can't stick to it. So they'll expand the whole thing. So the only way to avoid misuse of guns is to have those who might be victims of gun misuse to have a gun themselves, or somebody else with them who can protect them. So that's where you get the saying, the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. So if you are carrying a gun and somebody blows a fuse, goes silly, you get a road rage incident, somebody just snaps, then the solution to that, and they happen to have a gun, then the solution to that is lots of people around who have a gun themselves and who can prevent that person from doing any harm. So that's one argument. The more common argument is that the government has some sort of a role, and so shooters will pretty much agree that there are some people who shouldn't have guns. That's not really controversial. So there are people who are mentally unsound, and there are children, amongst others, who can't accept personal responsibility. They can't accept the consequences of the decisions they make. They're either too young or they're not mentally sound. There's also those who have a history of violence, and the expectation is, well, if they have access to a gun, they'll be violent again, and therefore that shouldn't be permitted. So that's the dilemma that most shooters find themselves in, trying to define what is acceptable for the government to regulate. So how do you prevent bad guys from getting guns? How do you define a bad guy? How do you define somebody who's got a mental problem? And, if you read the news, 3/4 of the world's got mental problems these days. And how do you write laws that protect the innocent and prevent the guilty or potentially guilty from inflicting violence on the innocent? That's a really interesting question, and governments do get it wrong most of the time. Even in America, they have their federal firearms law, which prohibits a whole series of people from owning guns, and they have their national instant check system. And so they have a list of people who are prohibited on various grounds. If they're dishonorably discharged from the military, for example, doesn't matter that they might have been discharged for non-violent reasons. It doesn't matter what the grounds are. They might have been stealing stuff or having an affair with the most recent.
Well, they misgendered somebody.
Somebody, yeah. They can be discharged from the military. They're not allowed to own a gun. They can be an illegal alien, not allowed to own a gun under federal laws. Illegal aliens are not necessarily violent. So even in America, where I would argue they have more respect for individual rights when it comes to gun control with the Second Amendment than they have in any other country, even there you could argue, they're a long way from getting it right. So this is an eternal dilemma, and I don't think there's any black and white answer. But what we do know is that there is only a limited number of people who should be restricted from having guns, a history of violence, obvious mental incapacity, juveniles who are not capable of accepting the consequences of what they're doing. They fall into that category. So then what do you do? Do you have a licensing system, or you just have a no, you can't buy one system? That produces another argument. I would argue that licenses are ridiculous. They're stupid things. You can either buy one or you can't. once you can buy one, if you are not in a prohibited category, not in a dangerous category, and it's got to be objective. It can't be, some whimsical thing by a bureaucrat. Once it's clear you're objectively not a dangerous person, what difference does it make what gun you've got, what type of gun you've got, or even how many guns you've got? It's irrelevant. It just doesn't make any difference whatsoever. And then if you become violent, you beat up your wife or you beat up your neighbour and you become like a thug, you might have 20 guns, you lose them all. You can't have any. And you can't get them back until you satisfy somebody that, you're not going to do that anymore. But my point is that this is an individual situation. It's not a collective situation. So you can't say because you're a certain age, because you're a certain gender, because you've got tattoos, because you have certain political or religious beliefs, or any of those sort of things, that you can't have a gun. It's got to be what you did as an individual that's disqualified you. It can't be anything else other than those individual traits.
Yes. What chance is there of Australia progressing in that direction? I mean, I can't even imagine that the populace at this point, when I was shooting IPSC, I know that most people were shocked that you were even able to have a handgun of any sort in your own property.
Yeah.
They just accept fully that nobody has them and nobody is allowed to have them except the government and the police.
Yeah.
I mean, can you see any hope for actually getting there? There wouldn't, I imagine, be much in the Senate or in Parliament interest in forwarding such an agenda. And anyone who did, I imagine, would be called a right-wing extremist, yada, yada, yada.
Yes. So under the current circumstances, no, there's no scenario where I can envisage that changing. But, you never say never. And for starters, you have to present the arguments. You have to undermine the logic, if there is any, the rationale, the reasons that presented. So you've got to have your case there on the shelf, ready to present it at the opportune time. That's important. So that's why you have to keep maintaining the argument. But there will come a time, things change, and sometimes they change very quickly. And so we see this now, the example being Trump and the woke issue. So all of a sudden, we switch from woke to anti-woke.
Yeah, the pendulum swings
The
all
pendulum
the way back.
swung back hard. What would make it swing back hard on the gun control issue? I don't know. Some people have suggested it might be a military conflict. You'd hope that it didn't come to that, but that's one possibility. But who knows what it might be? I think the strongest argument that Australian gun owners have for gun ownership is the self-defence issue. And that's the argument that the gun owners in America use to defend their right, their Second Amendment. It's the self-defence issue that wins. People can relate to that, even when they don't feel like they need a gun for self-defence themselves. They can acknowledge that I don't want to close off that avenue. I don't want to make that option unavailable to me. So in America, there's quite strong public support for ownership of guns for self-defence. Australians are obedient and compliant overall, and so I'm less optimistic on that front. But I don't think there's a better argument than self-defence. I think it still comes down to you're basically agreeing with the government that you are an undefended victim. you are expecting the government to save you, and the government's not capable of doing that.
Oh, that's
Indeed,
right.
the saying is, when seconds count, the police are minutes away. That's just the way it is. It may well be that a particularly egregious case where somebody is harmed who could have defended themselves but was prevented from doing that, maybe that will change public opinion. I don't know. I don't know what's going to do it. As it stands, I can't anticipate, what might prompt a change in the current policy. There's no doubt that gun owners are losing the argument, year by year at the moment. But it's not forever, and things do change.
Never know. It could come from an unexpected direction. I think the John Wick movies and seeing Keanu Reeves training in IPSC in order to do those movies has probably advertised the existence of IPSC to more people than anything that, IPSC ever did for itself.
Yes.
And it could be something along those lines. It just needs a cultural shift where, the kids decide that they want to do this sport, and all of a sudden it becomes culturally acceptable. I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, that argument is I hear that. So numbers count. So if there was a sudden influx of tens of thousands of people wanting to take up shooting, do IPSC, whatever, maybe it would change. Politics does respond to numbers. Maybe that would do it, but it would take pretty big numbers.
Of course,
yeah. But the answer is I don't know. I don't know what'll change it, but I live in hope that the pendulum will swing back. Something will make it swing back. There's plenty of examples of it having occurred in other fields, and there's no reason to believe it couldn't happen in the issue of shooting.
When you think of around the world where this has happened, really, it looks a bit bleak for what causes it to be undone. When it's Pol Pot takes away all of the guns and finally he's deposed of, and then all the people are like, you're never taking away our guns ever again. We don't really want a Pol Pot dictatorship in Australia first before we start wanting our guns back, do we?
No, that's right, we don't. But the funny thing is, 1996, they told us all, told everybody to hand in their guns, and I happen to know quite a lot of people who didn't. Yeah. So if there ever is a Pol Pot, I think Pol Pot might find there's more guns than he expected raised in opposition against him.
Hope so. Very interesting stuff, David. Thank you very much for your thoughts on that topic, and hopefully we'll get a few more comments in Liberty Itch once we've published this. So thank you again for your time and your thoughts.
You're welcome. Thank you.